Hi, and welcome back to Guff Stuff Weekly Podcast. I'm Javan, and today I have a guest via a call. I've been sick for the past, feels like almost 2 weeks now, and unable to make it into the shop, so Guff and I decided to do some remote recordings, and yeah, we're getting back, we're featuring someone who's been on the podcast before. Luke, also known as the Eldritch Pimp. Hi, Luke.
Hi.
What have you come here to talk to us about, or with us today about?
I've come here to talk about the implications of using D&D as a writing catalyst.
It seems like a pretty dense, maybe esoteric topic.
I mean, it's about as dense and esoteric as D&D itself.
That's fair. So I guess we could give a little bit of backstory about where this idea came up. What made you want to talk about this?
Well, I brought it up because I'm actually in the process of writing for a comic, and it involves characters that have been played in D&D.
Cool.
It's yeah. It's interesting because you spend, like, say you have your campaign that goes on for like 2 years or something like that. You kind of get into the head of your character a bit, and you can make them feel real and very I don't know, fleshed out.
Yeah, it's a very almost organic way to get in the headspace of a character and kind of find what motivates them or drives them through actual mock encounters within the D&D like game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool concept, and honestly, it's been around for quite a while. I mean, some of the most memorable D&D novels and characters even in D&D.
Mm-hmm.
Like a great example would be like Mordenkainen and the Circle of Eight. You know, the eight most
Yep.
powerful mages. They were all
Mm-hmm.
literally people like that played in Gary Gygax's original D&D campaign and made their own spells and played within the rules of basic, expert, and I believe all the way up through first edition D&D. And like Melf, I believe, was Gary Gygax's son. And so like they developed their own styles and developed their own way to play the game, and it actually became canon lore within the D&D universe, which I think is a testament to just like how cool it is.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the realm of like fostering and breeding creativity.
Absolutely.
I think another great example of like converting to story would be the Hickmans with Dragonlance. Like Dragonlance was just a campaign they played in, and it's become one of the most like loved novel series and settings in all of D&D, or Drizzt.
Oh yeah, Gist was like the first one that comes to my mind.
Yeah, it's a very common one. I mean, even Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms, which has been kind of the de facto setting for modules for quite a while, was just like his homebrewed campaign world. So there's this really cool idea that like something that you make and something that you flesh out in your experiences can become an actual, is bona fide the word I'm looking for? Like bona fide story and literature, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the process like for you then? You said you're making a comic.
Yeah.
Are you going through scenarios that your characters or the party has been through and kind of illustrating and adding more flavor to it, or are you like trying like what's your process like?
For like making a character, like I'll just like I use D&D Beyond a lot. That is a great resource to have. It just has all the books on it, like all in one place. So I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, I feel like there's like ideas that I want to go through because like obviously I'm not gonna be able to play all these characters in an actual like D&D campaign because one, that would take all the time in the world, which I don't have. But it's just something that's nice to be like, okay, I want to run through and say I want to try a cleric or something like that, and I look through all of the things that clerics can do, and I think of how that would be represented in the world that I'm making.
So
Like
you're
a good
almost
example is yeah, like a good example is an artificer that I've been messing around with. Like he's a artificer alchemist, but one of the things is like he has a thing for not just making poisons but consuming poisons, kind of
oh,
like a self-tester in a way.
kind of like a Dr. Jackal sort of deal.
Right. And like I'm like and it's like, okay, so like that's an interesting concept. Like what type of race would go well with that? And I'm like, okay, a Yuan-Ti would actually be good with that. So maybe I'm not writing like an actual Yuan-Ti character, but I'm taking elements from the Yuan-Ti and putting them into that. So it's like kind of serpentitious in certain ways. Maybe he has a lisp or something that is pretty prominent.
Yeah, kind of like a parcel tongue in Harry Potter where they draw out the S's and stuff.
Hmm.
Okay, so you're using,
Yeah.
so you're almost using it as a prompt for making characters as well.
Yes.
Okay, this actually interesting because there's a lot of older games that had like random tables for everything. And they've kind of come
Hmm.
back now in fifth edition with the backgrounds and all stuff like that, where you can kind of like roll you know, your quirks, so to speak. But there's like games like going outside of the realm of D&D just a little bit. Like there's a game like Traveler where you have a character creation system that is literally just like almost a whole entire novella of scenarios that you go through, and it kind of helps you make your backstory.
Hmm.
Cool. So I have a question then. When you show up to play a character in these games, and like when you show up to D&D, do you have like the character in mind already? Like their backstory, kind of like what's going on with them? Do you have that all figured out before you even like start?
No, not really. Sometimes it's easier to just roll up and be like, okay, they're here. Uh, they're here. They're here to adventure. They don't have a lot to like think about because like that's not really something that I think is important in the overall thing of like a D&D campaign. It's like, yeah, your backstory is what makes your character, but that's not the story of like D&D. It's not just about you and your experience. It's the whole group's experience. Like if other players in your thing have genuine have interest in that character, they can ask about it, but it's not the driving point of any plot,
Right.
in my opinion.
No, that's actually a really good point. I don't think we've talked about this too much, but it is something that I feel like it's lost in translation, especially with people who kind of gotten into D&D in maybe like the past 5 or 6 years, where
Hmm.
and not knocking on this at all, but it's just more of an observation that you tend to get players who like, for example, watch people live stream D&D. We'll use Critical Role because it's the most ubiquitous example.
Hmm.
You end up with people who have these long, convoluted, very specific backstories, and they bring them into the game and expect it to be like a huge part. And it's kind of a new school idea of like the heroic characters and the strong narrative of like your character having a ton of weight and your DM having to plan around like your backstory and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Whereas, there's an older generation of players and an older school of thought of Like I know when I tend to play, I show up with a character. I tend to randomize quite a bit when I play a character. And then I like to just experience them organically through play. I might not even know their backstory. I'll just like make it up as I go along and kind of like fumble my way through it. And that's a very like, I feel like that's a very big wedge in the two types of players, or not to categorize players into two types specifically, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where there's like
on the broader general sense of it.
yeah, there's a very big like, I write an 8-page backstory and I expect you to know all my characters' motivations. Yeah,
It's like that's the stuff that's the off paper stuff. So like you take a character, it's like, oh, my village was ransacked by barbarians or orcs or something like that. It's not going to be a thing with the DM to be like, okay, I'm going to have to make that encounter. It's if that anything like that ever shows up and they encounter like orc raiders or something like that, that's just something that it's going to be like that's going to affect my reaction towards it. I feel like that's a healthier way of going about it versus we need to find the people that did this, blah blah blah.
Yeah, it's almost like the difference between having your complete character motivation and backstory figured out from the get-go. Like there are things that can influence your character, and these are important. But I always think kind of back to like the older AD&D handbooks when you take like skills and proficiencies, right? They're like the secondary skill is a great example. This is what you did before you became an adventurer. You are an adventurer now. That is what you do. But this is kind of like how you got to where you are now. So there's this like unspoken, like you leave that behind you and then move forward with the story.
Yep. And then I kind of like how you were talking about like you'll just kind of randomize a lot of things, and I feel like that leaves a lot of space in to like when you say fill in the gaps and stuff. But what's really interesting about that is like when you can fill it in, all that you really have to go on is maybe some of your own experiences, and subconsciously you might be filling in the gaps with things that you didn't even know about yourself until you like retroactively like look back and be like, oh hey, I didn't know that, where'd that come from? And then you're like, oh, that was a part of me that came out, I didn't know that.
It's almost like a therapeutic session, so to speak. Where you
Exactly. Well, I mean, role playing in therapy is actually very common and very effective in some instances.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the research of it. I've heard it like mentioned before, but I mean, I could see where, you know, the introspection and the self-reflection via social interaction could be very beneficial to people who might need therapy in that way.
It's that back and forth, that conversation.
Yeah, it's taking an experience and kind of putting it on the table in a slight mask of disguise. So, I guess moving forward a little bit, I think maybe not to move forward. Maybe I'll put one last bit in on the whole randomized thing. I find that for me personally, and I think I've kind of trained the people that I've taught how to play D&D, people like my brother and a couple other ones who like really learn D&D with me, not like anywhere else. I feel like I try to instill to them like, if you go random and you kind of like leave your story open a little bit, like have a motivation, have a reason why you're out and stuff, like that's totally fine. But if you can use what the DM is like throwing at you for maybe what they have planned, you're being more generous to the DM. And I'm always an advocate for being generous to the DM. Because
there's a lot put on them.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge advocate for that. It's so important, I feel. And I'm not saying give the DM everything and bow down to their every whim, but like if when you're making your character, if you don't come in with a preconceived notion of another character that you're trying to emulate or a complete backstory that you've had in your head for a long time, like make it flexible, you know, it makes it a lot more interesting that way too. Because the whole thing of D&D is telling a story together. That being said, let's morph forward now, unless you want to talk any more on that point.
I'm good. Let's move on.
So, how has playing D&D influenced your webcomic specific, or sorry, I said webcomic, but your comic that you're working on? Your is it like going to be like a graphic novel, like a full length thing, or is it just kind of like episodic? What do you like? How are you modeling
It's
everything? Tell me about it.
it's going to be uh it's going to be taking place over. I'm planning on like 10 stories between 10 different characters, and they're each of it is going to be their perspective on the same event that's happening around them. Like there's going to be like a large overarching plot that's happening, and these 10 characters are going to be juggling through events, influencing one another, and crisscrossing over. So like in some instances it'll see like a group of them together, like maybe two or three of them are together at an instance, and then they'll split up and meet up with some other people, but they're kind of like converging and diverging with themselves, and then ultimately ending up in like the same uh like eventually there'll be like a large convergence at the end where they all kind of like meet up and like find the BBEG and all that stuff, like typical D&D style.
Right, but so it's almost like a split. It's almost like a split the party and they meet up at the end kind of thing going on.
Right, and like so like in one like if I'm making the 10 stories out of it, you'll there'll be like overlapping scenes but from different perspectives.
Oh, that's cool.
Like to one character it might just be a brief encounter, but to another one it might mean their entire story.
Oh yeah, kind of like how like the this is gonna be a weird analogy, but like
Mm.
the football player walking down the hall to go out onto the field meets the kid, throws him the towel. That towel means everything to the kid. The football player's like, that was just a towel. Like kind of
Yeah,
that.
like that thing smelled so bad. Yeah.
So I guess
Mhm.
I want to like peel back the layers a little bit here then, and kind of get to like what the initial topic, kind of back to that a little bit. So how
Mhm.
did you playing D&D influence this story idea that you had, or some of the characters in it, or both?
uh like if anything it was, I played these characters for so long and I'm just like, and for some characters I didn't feel like it felt right just dropping them at that point and like moving on with my life. I'm just like, no, there was like I had like there was ideas that I had in my head, and they just kind of compounded over the years, and I'm just got to the point where I'm just like, you know what, this is a story I want to tell. Like this is something that's, it means something to me, and I feel like it would do the character justice as well. Like I'm almost doing it for the character's benefit more than my own. Like kind of giving them a proper send off.
Yeah, so I kind of know exactly what you mean here. One of the very first characters I played, if not the first character I played, had a horrible send off. Like the campaign just abruptly ended, and
Mm-hmm.
so my way of dealing with that was writing him into campaigns later on as I ran as a DM as like a side character. Like he'd show up every once in a while. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really common theme, especially with people who played and then go to DMing. They like to recycle characters, especially if they didn't get a decisive ending.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's cool because like you spend like 4 years in a campaign. It makes sense to bring them back as an NPC because that is a very well flushed out NPC.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that character has depth to them. Whether or not the players dive into that or not is like that's just something that a DM always has.
Yeah, and when you present a character that has depth, I feel just through like observations that the actual party members attach to them a little bit more because they feel more real, I guess. Like they feel like they have
Mm-hmm.
wants and motivations. And and that's basically like writing a story then, right? So
Yep.
it kind of translates very naturally into novels or other sorts of media of storytelling.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic. And I feel like in the past, maybe probably decade, it's been picking up traction with the medium of like just watching people play D&D. We talked about this a little bit earlier. You used to read, like, it's really funny because you'd read the Drizzt novels, and then in the late 90s, early 2000s, when people were playing D&D, there were so many dual scimitar wielding drow rangers out there. Like,
Hmm.
it was crazy.
Yep.
I remember reading forums and posts about it, and people would be like, it was just rampant, right?
Hmm.
But so it makes a lot of sense now that when you have something as popular as, say, live action D&D, or not live action, but like watching people play their campaigns of D&D, the more popular ones are going to be the ones that are emulated, and they're very
Hmm.
very in-depth characters from the get-go, and so that kind of gets emulated. Am I making any sense on this?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of like the pop music thing, right? Like whatever's popular
Hmm.
is going to be the most prevalent type of thing at the
Yeah.
time.
Or a good example is like in anime a lot. Like there are so many Goku clones out there. It's not even
Well,
funny,
I
but it's
suppose
also like
he's so beloved.
that's what's been, yeah, it's what's been around. It's like he's the backbone of that type of archetype, and that's essentially what it kind of boils down to. It's like we're in the point of creating like narrative archetypes for the world, and I feel like D&D is kind of like it has a very good base to build off of. Like if you want to like when you think about like when I'm going back to like using D&D as a way to build a character, it's like your classes are your archetypes that you can use. Like you need your nerdy dude. Yeah, you got your wizard, sorcerer. You can use those. You have your big brawler dude. You could do fighter. You could do barbarian, or you could just kind of mash them all together, and it doesn't have to like follow the exact strict rules of D&D. Like if you can using monk for an example, like all the different ways that you can use, you don't have to just pick one and go. You could have someone that's like, oh, they know all the different ways, they know all the different subclasses
Mm.
because of like of that concept, but like you can use those things to give you like a representation of like what they can do, and then you can put that into your medium.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to like one of the first, like, to summarize kind of what the hypothesis is, so to speak, is if you have a good framework for a character that isn't too dense, you can build onto that character as you play the game and truly flesh them out and make them feel organic. Like
Hmm.
like if you pile everything onto the character and have everything known about them from the get-go, what's there to learn about the character?
Right. And not just for the reader, but for the writer itself. Like what's nice about throwing them into the D&D world is that you're getting, oh, it's almost like you're having a conversation with someone as you're writing it. It's like you're co-writing a character, but it doesn't feel like you're co-writing a character.
It's almost like fate begins to have agency in the character's like story, like actual fate,
Hmm.
and it almost gives like a true life to the character because it's not predetermined. You're learning as you go along.
Hmm.
No, I think that's very like I like that. That's a really good way of putting it. But yeah, do you have anything else you wanna bring up about this?
Not really. I think I don't want to get too much into it without actually spoiling the story.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. I know you've been talking about it for a while, and
Hmm.
for the listeners that are at the what I assume is going to be close to the end of the podcast here. Why don't you tell them about where they can find your stuff? I'll put links in the description and everything as well too.
Oh, I'm on Instagram at the Eldritch Pimp. I'm on Twitch. I sometimes I'll stream art and games on that. Also under the name Eldritch Pimp, and then in those there's links to my art store where you can kind of just see some of the stuff that I've had in my past, and yeah.
Yeah, and the art store I'm going to add is really, really cool because if it wasn't, I guess, stated, Luke and I played in D&D games together for a long time. And so I've got to see a lot of his characters that he's played or characters he's played with literally come to life through his art, and it's so cool. It's
okay.
really...
Okay, I will have to say something on that. It is something amazing when you like play out a scene in D&D and it leaves such a profound impression on an artist that when they sit down and put what's in their mind onto like paper or whatever medium that is, and then you show that to the other players, and they're like, "Oh my God, that's it."
Yeah, where you
that's it's a feeling I cannot describe, but it is ecstatic.
Yeah, so for all of you D&D players out there that want a little extra credit with your other players, if you're artistically inclined, by all means do art for the other players, like draw their characters, draw their stuff. I have only ever seen it go well with minis painted or art, like hand-drawn pencil art, or short stories. I've seen people write short stories about other people's characters and scenarios and stuff, and it's always a good time. So like that's one of the things you can do like in between sessions and stuff. It's just so awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, thanks for coming on the podcast, Luke.
Absolutely, anytime.
And we will catch you all in the next episode. Take care now.